Lastly, I want to come to the phenomenon of genocide, specifically the Holocaust, in the context of the Second World War. Genocide is a term that was coined during the Second World War era to describe what was being done to the Jews. Genocide involves making war upon an entire people, and the Holocaust is not the only example of this. Uh, there was, for example, in 1994, an instance of genocide in Rwanda when the majority group within that country, um, the Hutus, um, uh, launched a months-long campaign of genocide against the minority group within Rwanda, the Tutsis. And this resulted ultimately in over 1 million lives, if you include both the casualties inflicted upon the Tutsis and the subsequent casualties inflicted upon the Hutus. So to that, I could offer examples from Cambodia, the so-called auto-genocide of Cambodia. If you wanted to go back to the First World War, I could talk about the genocide by the Ottoman Empire against the Armenians, and there are other examples beyond that. But genocide refers to a total phenomenon of making war upon an entire ethnic group. And the Holocaust can be expressed as a culmination of factors facilitating war, total war. And as most of you, I think, are aware, this was the Nazi attempt to exterminate all the Jews living in Europe, as well, by the way, as of millions of other ethnic groups considered to be undesirable by the Nazis. What you're looking at here is the entrance to the Auschwitz death camp, located in what is now southwestern Poland. And the persecution of the Jews began in Germany in 1935 with the passage of certain laws called the Nuremberg laws that systematically whittled away at the civil rights of the Jewish population and against their property rights in a way that was repressive in and of itself. This was followed in November 1938 by something called the Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, and that was a supposedly spontaneous series of riots by Germans, particularly sort of civilian adherents to the Nazi Party, in which they destroyed the storefront windows of Jewish-owned businesses, vandalized Jewish synagogues, and the like. At the same time that this was going on, the Nazis were conducting their first experiments with the mass killing of people that they considered to be undesirable. This included people who we would now call mentally challenged. It included people like me, who had mental illnesses and were considered to be, quote, life unworthy of life, and other groups that the Nazis did not like. And this, by the way, was not an entirely Nazi-generated phenomenon, or rather to say the ideas didn't come entirely out of Nazi Germany. What the Germans were practicing was what was called eugenics. That is spelled Eugenick. And eugenics was the idea of getting rid of people who were mentally challenged or mentally ill or had some kind of other congenital disability that they could pass along to their children. And the idea was that if you could rid society of these people and prevent them from reproducing, you could create a better, healthier society. And this wasn't just a Nazi idea. You see this idea discussed widely in the United States. There are laws. There were laws on the books allowing for this kind of thing. There was a law on the books in Virginia, for example, that made it legal to sterilize men and women who were considered to be mentally challenged, so that they could no longer have children. So the Nazis took this existing idea and carried it to an extreme, or rather, perhaps to its logical culminating point. In 1939 and 1940, after the Germans had captured Poland in a lightning campaign in September of 1939, afterward, they began to pack the Jewish population of Poland, which was a very large population of Jewish persons, into ghettos, into a few blocks of the cities of Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, and a variety of other cities. And then, when the Nazis invaded Russia in June 1941, along with the German army, went squads of specially trained Einsatzgruppen, special action groups, whose job it was to identify, round up, and kill Russian Jews. And they did these killings by tens of thousands. But what was found was that these kinds of killings were inefficient and also psychologically hard on the soldiers who had to do it. Even though these were SS soldiers, the idea of shooting men, women, and particularly children in cold blood began to wear on them after a while. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for them by any stretch of the imagination. What I am trying to say is that the Nazi leadership found this to be unacceptable, began to look for a better way, a more efficient way of carrying out these killings of Jews. And what they ultimately came up with was worked out in final form at a conference in Wannsee, which was a large mansion. You see it here outside of Berlin. The conference occurred on January 20th, 1942. There were supposed to be no minutes left of the meeting. There were minutes that were made at the time. They were distributed. They were all supposed to be destroyed afterward. But everybody connected with the so-called Jewish question within the Nazi government was brought together in a meeting by an SS officer. He worked directly for the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. And this SS officer's name was Reinhard Heydrich. You don't need to know the names. I just want you to hear what I'm saying. And Heydrich went before these other people involved with the with handling issues concerning the Jews, and essentially laid before them, under the guise of consulting with them. Basically, what he laid before them was what the SS top of the hierarchy had decided to do. And the idea was to comb Europe from west to east and transport all the Jews into occupied Poland, and then to create a combination of slave labor camps and death camps, some of which were co-located. And the idea behind the slave labor camps is that you would get all of the labor out of Jews that were in good shape, with minimal attention to their nutrition needs, to protecting them from disease and so forth, and that you would essentially work them to death. And that would be one way by which to eliminate the Jewish population. The second one, for people who were either too old or otherwise not capable of this kind of labor would be to send them directly to camps that were designed uh, to to kill them. This is a map showing the major death camps in occupied Poland. The 1939 boundaries of Poland are in yellow there. By this time, it had been divided up between the Germans and the Soviet Union. But if you look and you'll see there, you'll see Auschwitz down in the southwest corner of what had been Poland. It was a combination labor camp and death camp. Chelmo, Treblinka, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Belzec were the other extermination camps, and these were constructed specifically to slaughter Jews under industrialized conditions that were intended to kill tens of thousands of Jews on a single day, to try to have that capacity and to try to have the work of destroying the entire Jewish population within a matter of months, if not a few years. And we've talked about with Victor Davis Hanson's Western way of war, Hanson thesis, in which he talks about certain cultural traits, longstanding cultural traits in Western civilization that made the Western military way of war so effective and so dangerous. You can take the idea underpinning the Holocaust and the capabilities underpinning the Holocaust, and also trace those back to certain longstanding cultural traits within Western civilization in a much darker kind of way. The first goes back to this idea of bureaucracy and an enhanced span of control. I've talked about this before in the context of industrialization, but bureaucracy actually precedes this. The beginnings of modern democracy occur under the reign of Louis XIV, shown on the left, and then two key ministers. I won't get into their precise jobs here, but what I will say is that the monarchy of Louis XIV depended in many ways on having this enhanced span of control, the ability to understand what was going on in their society in the sense of what kind of economic activity is going on such that we can extract taxes from it. How much does an army need to be paid? How much does it need in terms of uniforms and supplies and equipment and ammunition? How do you get that from point A to point B? How do you get reliable reports from what's going on in those within those armies and navies, and also within the civilian components of your kingdom? The French essentially created bureaucracy on this particular scale. And without bureaucracy, you don't have the ability, when it comes to the Holocaust, you don't have the ability to identify who is Jewish. You don't have the ability to come up with systematic ways of not just identifying those who are Jewish, but of getting them to transportation points. First, you put them in deportation camps, then you put them aboard trains, and then you send them to the east to these concentration camps, and then you keep track of them once they are there. Without this tremendous bureaucratic capability, you aren't able to have the Holocaust in the sense that it occurred during the Second World War. Secondly, nationalism, and we are sometimes inclined to think of nationalism as something positive, perhaps because it involves the idea of the people as the source of legitimate authority. That's an attractive idea to us nowadays. But nationalism is in itself sort of value neutral. It can be used in good respects. It can be used in bad respects. Um, and the Nazis used nationalism uh, in a very bad respect indeed. In the case of the Nazi brand of nationalism, adherence to the morality of the state, of the nation state, as the Nazis organized it and ascribed values to it and ascribed Nazi Germany's place in the world. It's sort of it's kind of what it considered to be sort of the moral obligation of Nazi Germany, which was um, uh, to to raise up and to create a hegemony of what they call the Aryan race, what we would call a certain kind of white race over all others. This was a kind of nationalism as espoused by the Nazis, and as an extension of this, the Nazi brand of nationalism um, squashed and denigrated and tried to eliminate all other um, loci or a locus, that's the plural term, all other places from which people could get an idea of what was morally right. And so the Nazis denigrated religion. This included Christianity. They actually imprisoned German clergy who spoke out against what the Nazis were doing. And they tried to make the Nazi regime the only place that the German people could look to for their ideas of what was right and what was wrong. And so Nazism's sense of having a world historical mission uh, to create the triumph of white supremacy legitimized their elimination of the Jews. So you have that as an element that goes into the Holocaust. You also have industrialization. What you're looking at here is the totality of the Auschwitz concentration camp, and a lot of these barracks that you're looking at, and they go on and on for for a considerable area. You're talking about several square miles. Consists of the barracks for laborers and manufacturing outfits in which these laborers turned out uniforms, ammunition, all sorts of things that the Nazi regime required. So Auschwitz was more than a death camp, although it involved that as well. The Birkenau facility within Auschwitz was devoted to the systematic killing of Jews. But without industrialization, you would not have had concentration camps on this scale, and without the modern chemical industry, you would not have had the mass production of Zyklon B. And Zyklon B was an insecticide. And it had been created before the war, and it turned out that it was effective in terms of asphyxiating and poisoning large numbers of people once they were crowded into a gas chamber. And so most of the Jews that were killed during the Holocaust were killed in this systematized, industrialized death camp. Um, Death camps in which Zyklon B was the sort of the Nazi weapon of choice in terms of slaughtering this population. Moreover, German manufacturers were approached to create crematoria. Basically, the idea was we need to have a crematorium capable of burning the bodies of tens of thousands of people in an efficient kind of way. And rather than these manufacturers going, my God, that's horrible, we won't do that, they were kind of like, well, exactly how many people are you talking about? exactly how long does it take will it take for us to develop these things? What's your deadline? How much are we going to get paid? And so on. None of this would have been none of this would have been possible without industrialization. And then finally, you have slavery. And of course, this is a very old um, human institution, goes back to ancient times. The kind of slavery that we're talking about is the slavery that occurred in North America, Central America, South America, and particularly the Caribbean. Because in the Caribbean, um, uh, people died, enslaved persons died at such a rate that it outstripped their ability to reproduce. It outstripped their ability to have children. In North America and the United States, enslaved persons survived long enough to have children, and these children grew to adulthood and became slaves as well. And so the need to bring new slaves into the United States after a while was no longer necessary. Not only was it no longer necessary, but Southern slaveholders in states like Virginia and North Carolina, where slavery was becoming somewhat less necessary, began to export their surplus enslaved persons to the Deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, and the like. But none of this was true in the West Indies. In the West Indies, because of tropical diseases, um, slaves were literally worked to death between fatigue, between malnutrition, and particularly because of disease, they died at tremendous rates. And so, if you look at the absolute numbers of enslaved persons brought from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, by far the most went into the West Indies, because there the practice was indeed to work human beings until they died. And so, if you're talking about Nazi slave labor, working people to death, that's nothing new. That is something that had been happening for hundreds of years in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the West Indies. And finally, you have mass slaughter. And this was the mass slaughter of the First World War. And the idea behind this is it got Europeans used to the idea that millions of people might be killed in a war, and they're thinking first of all about millions of our own people, millions of our own um, sons, brothers, fathers, and so forth, were sacrificed on the battlefields of the First World War, and so this made it possible for people in the SS, who were directly responsible for the Holocaust, and also the German people who knew what was going on. They pretended not to know what was going on, but many of them, really did know at least some of it. It enabled them to rationalize the killing of millions of Jews, because millions of soldiers had already died on the battlefields of the First World War. So you put all of these components together, all of these factors together, these long-term operating factors in Western civilization, and you get the components that went into the Holocaust. I'll leave you here with this image. One of the things that the Nazis were very careful not to do was to take photographs of what went on in the death camps. We do not have photographs of the Nazi transports coming into these death camps. We do not have pictures of people being made ready to go into the gas chambers. We don't have photographs of the gas chambers in operation. All we have is the testimony of those who survived what went on in the death camps. Those who somehow managed to escape the gas chambers, often by being put to work by the Nazis, and also by sketches and paintings made by Holocaust survivors, such as Ludwig Meidner, whose sketch of the gas chambers um, is shown here. And so this, in kinds of ways, is an ultimate expression of total war. Uh, this is, again, an example of war in which a society is mobilized to a complete or near complete degree for the prosecution of war, and then an application of violence across a wide spectrum of the enemy society. And if an enemy society is in effect demonized enough by a belligerent country, in this case, Nazi Germany, there got to be absolutely no limit on what that nation was prepared to do and did do. We'll stop there.